When privilege clashes with justice, watch as an entitled socialite faces a no-nonsense judge and receives a lesson she'll never forget. The courtroom was full that morning, buzzing softly as people settled into their seats. It seemed like a regular day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, except for one key detail. This hearing was expected to attract attention. Tiffany Halstead, a well-known socialite with a reputation for reckless actions and a sense of entitlement, was set to appear before Judge William Grant, famous for his calm demeanor and sharp mind. Judge Grant was widely respected for being fair, but firm in delivering justice. Tiffany entered fashionably late, as usual, showing no signs of apology. Dressed in high-end designer clothes and oversized sunglasses, she walked into the room as if she were on a red carpet. Her lawyer, clearly uncomfortable, trailed behind her, trying to reduce the spectacle. The usually decorous courtroom fell quiet as all eyes turned to her. Tiffany stopped halfway down the aisle, unaware of, or perhaps indifferent to, the fact that people were waiting for her to sit. She waved her lawyer aside dismissively so she could place her bag down. With exaggerated flair, she removed her sunglasses, surveying the room like it was beneath her. Moments later, Judge Grant entered, and the room's energy shifted instantly. The chatter stopped, replaced by respectful silence. In his mid-50s, Grant was a commanding presence, tall and authoritative. His sharp eyes briefly scanned the room before he took his seat. Tiffany hesitated when the bailiff called for everyone to stand, visibly irritated before reluctantly rising with a sigh. Her expression made it clear she felt she had no reason to be there. Judge Grant remained composed as he adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the case. Tiffany's situation was fairly simple. Multiple parking violations and a reckless driving incident that had put a pedestrian in danger. What should have been a straightforward hearing was about to become far more eventful, thanks to Tiffany's attitude. As Judge Grant outlined the charges, Tiffany's posture became more relaxed. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and rolled her eyes, a clear sign of disrespect. Judge Grant, however, stayed composed and professional, speaking in a measured tone as though daring her to continue. The tension in the room grew as seasoned observers sensed something was coming. But Tiffany, unaware of the storm brewing, remained defiant. She started tapping her perfectly manicured nails on the table, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something urgently, but she dismissed him with a casual flick of her hand. Judge Grant asked her to confirm her identity. Without even looking up, Tiffany responded, "Yeah, that's me," her voice filled with indifference. A murmur rippled through the room. Judge Grant remained calm, but his gaze lingered on Tiffany. "Miss Halstead," he began, "we maintain a certain level of respect in this courtroom. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, seeming to find the judge's words amusing. She leaned back and twirled a lock of hair between her fingers. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied sarcastically. Gasps were heard throughout the room as even her lawyer hid his face in embarrassment. Judge Grant, still unshaken, asked, "Do you understand the charges against you today?" Tiffany sighed dramatically. "Honestly, no. It's just some parking tickets and someone getting scared because I hit the gas too hard. This is such a waste of time." The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to the judge, who calmly closed the file, removed his glasses, and placed them on the bench. Time seemed to freeze. "Miss Halstead," the judge said slowly, his voice steady but firm, "I advise you to choose your words wisely from this point onward." Tiffany, still oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, shrugged. "What? It's true. It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." Judge Grant's response was swift but measured. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Halstead?" His tone was calm, almost conversational, but impossible to ignore. Tiffany scoffed. "Yeah, I mean, come on. It's not like I robbed a bank or anything. This is just overkill." She waved dismissively, as if brushing off something trivial. Judge Grant nodded. "Let me make something clear, Miss Halstead. The charges against you include reckless driving and endangering a pedestrian. Accountability is not measured by the size of the offense, but by the impact of the actions. Do you understand that? Tiffany rolled her eyes again, muttering under her breath, Sure, whatever you say," though whispered. Her words carried in the silence of the courtroom. For the first time, Tiffany's smirk faded slightly as Judge Grant reached for a document. He spoke to the room. Let the record show that the pedestrian, Mr. Edward Lopez, a 67-year-old retired teacher, was crossing the street legally when Miss Halstead accelerated, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist. He has since sought medical care and continues to experience pain. Tiffany glanced at her lawyer, who whispered something urgently, but she brushed him off again. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He was fine." Judge Grant's gaze intensified. "Does this sound like no harm, no foul to you, Miss Halstead?" Before Tiffany could reply, the next move Judge Grant made would make it clear that her actions had lasting consequences she could no longer ignore. "Your perspective on this situation is concerning," Judge Grant began. "Not because of the charges themselves, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the weight of your actions." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, pretending to be indifferent, though the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. "Look, I said I didn't hit him. People are just overreacting these days." That comment caused a few gasps from the courtroom audience. Judge Grant tapped his pen on the desk, pausing briefly before responding. "Overreacting," he repeated, his voice still calm. "Would you like to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, Miss Halstead? Because he's here today, in this courtroom." The atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Tiffany's confident expression faltered, her eyes darting toward the gallery. Sitting quietly in the second row, Mr. Lopez had his arm in a sling. His weathered face showed no anger, only quiet disappointment, which felt far more cutting than any harsh words could. Tiffany shifted uneasily in her seat, though her defiant attitude hadn't completely disappeared. "I'm sure he's fine," she muttered, though her voice lacked the confidence it had before. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, his presence dominating the room. "Miss Halstead, your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But this is not just about him. It's about the precedent we set when individuals with privilege believe they are above accountability." The room was so silent that even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen could be heard. All eyes were on Judge Grant, waiting to see what he would do next. Then, with a calm that carried the weight of his words, he said, "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Tiffany blinked, her earlier bravado starting to crumble. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern for the first time. Judge Grant didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured to the bailiff, who handed him a stack of papers. The judge began reading aloud, detailing the fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training Tiffany would need to complete. But it wasn't the penalties themselves that made the biggest impact. It was how he delivered them, weaving in a strong message about privilege, empathy, and the responsibility of living in a shared society. What really shook Tiffany, though, was the unexpected final decision Judge Grant announced, one that would make her face reality in a way she could no longer avoid. Judge Grant set the papers down, his gaze unwavering. His next words seemed to fill the room before they were even spoken. "Miss Halstead," he began, "I have reviewed this case in depth. Given the seriousness of your actions and your clear disregard for accountability, I'm issuing a sentence that I believe will not only address the legal violations, but also provide you with a much-needed perspective." Tiffany sat up straighter, her earlier flippancy replaced by unease. "Perspective?" she echoed, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," Judge Grant replied firmly. "Along with the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardships, often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then, you'll begin to understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement." A murmur spread through the room. This wasn't a typical sentence, and the crowd's mixed reactions were clear. Some nodded approvingly, while others exchanged surprised glances. But the most telling reaction came from Tiffany. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice rising. "You want me to hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem." Judge Grant's expression remained unchanged, though his voice grew colder. "Miss Halstead, it's precisely that attitude that brought you here today. Your actions show a lack of understanding, a refusal to see how your choices affect others. This is not a punishment. It's an opportunity for you to grow. And let me be clear, failure to comply will result in a far more severe sentence." Tiffany's lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering something urgently, but she pulled her arm away. "This is ridiculous. You can't make me do this." Judge Grant raised his hand, silencing her outburst. "Miss Halstead, this court has the authority to enforce community service as part of your sentence. You will report to the shelter each morning, and your supervisor will provide weekly progress reports. Should you fail to cooperate, I'll see you back here under much less favorable circumstances." The room went silent again, the weight of Judge Grant's words hanging heavily in the air. Tiffany's face flushed with anger, but for once, she said nothing. She sat there, stunned and silent. But the moment wasn't over yet. Judge Grant's final remarks would leave a lasting impact, not only on Tiffany but on everyone in the room. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses, his calm demeanor unshaken by Tiffany's defiance. He let the silence linger for a moment, ensuring his next words would resonate. "Miss Halstead," he said, "this courtroom does not exist to humiliate or belittle. It exists to uphold justice and, when possible, to teach. Your privilege has shielded you from consequences for too long, and it has cost you the ability to empathize. This isn't about punishment. It's about helping you regain your sense of humanity." The courtroom held its breath. Tiffany, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at the gallery, her bravado fading even more. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then reconsidered. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked about his feelings towards you?" Judge Grant asked, his tone softer now, almost conversational. Tiffany shook her head, her eyes darting toward Mr. Lopez, who remained seated in the gallery. His expression still reflected quiet disappointment. He said, Judge Grant continued, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand, because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people. And one day, it might be something she can't undo." The words hit hard. Tiffany's face turned pale, her usual composure unraveling. For the first time, her defiance gave way to something else, discomfort, maybe even guilt. Judge Grant didn't relent. "Mr. Lopez, a man you nearly injured, has chosen grace over anger. He could have asked for a harsher penalty, but instead, he asked for something different, a chance for you to learn. That's what the sentence is about." Tiffany shifted in her chair, her confidence eroding. The room was so quiet that every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, felt amplified. "You will report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday," Judge Grant said. "There, you will meet women who have faced struggles you can't even begin to imagine. Some have lost everything. Some are rebuilding their lives from the ground up. You will listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you will start to understand the value of humility and responsibility." Tiffany looked like she wanted to protest, but she stayed silent, clearly shaken by the weight of her situation. But the gravity of the situation seemed to hold her back. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to stay quiet. Yet, even as the judge's words began to sink in, the real transformation for Tiffany would only start once she stepped out of the protective bubble of her privilege. The gavel struck with a sharp crack, marking the end of the hearing. "This court is adjourned," Judge Grant declared firmly. Standing up and exiting the courtroom, the tension in the room lingered, like the aftermath of a storm. Tiffany sat there, disbelief and frustration mixing on her face. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering rapidly, but she barely reacted. As the gallery began to empty, the murmurs of onlookers filled the room, discussing the intense courtroom moment they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez, his arm still in a sling from the incident that brought them here, stood slowly. As he passed by, his face remained kind but resolute. Tiffany avoided his gaze, staring blankly at the table in front of her. Outside, reporters were already waiting, eager to catch the aftermath of the dramatic hearing. Tiffany's name, long tied to her lavish socialite lifestyle, was now linked to this courtroom drama. Cameras flashed as she stepped out, flanked by her lawyer, who attempted to shield her from the barrage of questions. "Miss Halstead, do you have any thoughts on today's decision?" a reporter called out. "Do you think the sentence was fair?" Tiffany's typical arrogance flickered back for a brief moment. "No comment," she snapped, brushing past the crowd into the waiting car. But inside, her composure faltered. As the car doors closed and the noise of the crowd faded, her shoulders slumped slightly. For the first time, reality seemed to be sinking in. That evening, the case became the top headline across news outlets. Clips from the courtroom, including Judge Grant's powerful words, spread quickly, sparking widespread discussion. Social media was abuzz with opinions, some applauding the judge's decision, others criticizing Tiffany's attitude. The most touching commentary came from Mr. Lopez, who gave a brief statement outside the courthouse. "I don't want her to fail," he said softly. "I just hope she learns. Because when we stop learning, we stop growing, and that's when we truly lose." His words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the courtroom. But for Tiffany, the lesson was only just beginning. Monday loomed ahead, bringing with it a world far removed from her privileged lifestyle. Monday morning brought an unfamiliar chill, both in the air and within Tiffany herself. Standing outside the women's shelter, her oversized sunglasses couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. The building was humble, bustling with activity as volunteers moved around, busy with their tasks. For the first time in a long while, Tiffany felt out of place. As she stepped inside, the sounds of voices and the clatter of kitchen utensils greeted her. A staff member, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, approached. "You must be Tiffany," she said, her tone firm but welcoming. "Let's get you started." At first, time seemed to drag. Tiffany was tasked with preparing meals, serving food, and cleaning up afterward. She didn't talk much, keeping her head down, her usual confidence gone. But as the hours passed, she began noticing things she hadn't before. The warmth and the smiles of the shelter's guests, the sense of community among the staff, and the strength in the stories she overheard. One woman, a single mother of 3, shared her challenges with Tiffany over lunch. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of years of hardship. "You think you've got it all figured out," she said, her eyes meeting Tiffany's. "But life has a way of showing you what really matters." That evening, driving home, Tiffany's mind was unusually quiet. The faces of the people she had met stayed with her, along with Judge Grant's words. For the first time, she began to question the world she had built for herself, a world of privilege, isolation, and superficiality. In the weeks that followed, Tiffany's mandatory service continued. Day by day, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. She listened more, spoke less, and slowly, almost without noticing, began to change. By the time her sentence ended, she stood before Judge Grant again, a quieter, more reflective version of herself. "Thank you," she said calmly, "for not giving up on me." Judge Grant nodded, his expression softening slightly. "The real gratitude will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." As Tiffany left the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, she carried with her a newfound hope, a chance to rebuild not just her life, but her perspective. And so, Tiffany's journey became a reminder to everyone that true change is possible, but it requires humility, courage, and the willingness to face one's flaws. What will you do today to open your heart and mind to life's lessons? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and growth.